Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored today to be sitting down with Dr. Marc Faber. He's editor and publisher of the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report. Dr. Faber, my first question for you is, how would you explain this period of history through which we're all living today?
Well, I think in the world, we've already had for the last few thousand years cycles of prosperity and then cycles of less prosperity. We have business cycles, very long-term cycles in business, sometimes called Kondratievs. And then we have shorter cycles, say 22 years cycle is the Kuznets. And then we have shorter cycles, the jugular cycle of 9 to 12 years, and the kitchen cycle of something like 4 years. So in economics, we are very familiar with cycles. Monetary policy and fiscal policy can obscure these cycles to some extent, but they reassert themselves sooner or later. And in politics, we have political cycles and cycles in societies that have a lot to do with societies becoming affluent. And once they become affluent, they have the tendency in all societies to overspend and to become complacent within the society and to work less and have more leisure and so forth. And so societies go down. I've written about business cycles extensively in the past. And I've also written about the rise and the fall of major cities in the world. So you have some cities that became very wealthy, like Constantinople, or cities like Cartagena, or Venice, or Augsburg, and Salzburg, and Florence, and Genoa. And then they went downhill again. And in America, if you look, you also had the expansion of America. When America began to industrialize, the industrialization occurred on the East Coast, mostly around the Boston area, Massachusetts. And then it progressed to the West, to the Midwest, Chicago, and so forth. And then finally, at the end of the 19th century, into California. So we have these cycles, and we have societies that rise and then fall again. We had a good example in the case of Japan. By 1989, it was 50% of the global stock market capitalization in a country of 120 million people at the time. This was remarkable, and everybody was saying, oh, the Japanese banks will own everything in the world, and the Japanese here and the Japanese there. And then already in 78, China began to open up, and so they became a major competitor to Japan in terms of manufacturing. And before that, already Taiwan and South Korea had become major competitors to Japan. So we have these cycles of prosperity and rapid growth spurts, and then inevitably economies slow down. Or, as usually happens, there's a ruling class that comes in and has an undue influence on society. And the ruling class is usually not the smartest class. In particular, in democracies, democracies bring about mediocre people, very mediocre people at the government level. And this was incidentally not the original idea of democracies. Democracies were never meant to be that everybody can vote. That I have to stress, that already the Greeks who advocated democracies, or the Enlightenment visionaries like Locke and Hobbes and Spinoza, they advocated democracy, but only people with some education should vote, and not analphabets and people without any knowledge, and also non-taxpayers. So this is a new thing that we have in the world. And I think we have a society. I mean, I was just looking today at statistics. In my generation, which is just at the beginning of the boomers, 1946 born, nobody, I mean, 2% of the people nowadays in that generation identify themselves with the LGBTQ crowd. The generation Z, the ones born after 1996, more than 20% identify themselves with that kind of natural law. So I don't know. You know, for me, a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And if you look at the movies, that's why I think it's very, the modern society wants to cancel culture and cancel history and so forth. This is, of course, nonsense, because if you watch movies of the 1920s up to the 1960s, 70s, in those movies, everybody smokes. Initially only the man, but later on, when the tobacco companies wanted to promote cigarette smoking among women, also women always smoke. And it becomes very fashionable. Now there's practically no movie do they smoke. And in those days, men were men and women were women, and the man beat up the women from time to time, and it was totally acceptable. I mean, I was just looking at the series recently about the royalties in Europe. It's like a 6-part series. And they were all related to each other, the European royals. When World War I broke out, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, King George, and Kaiser Wilhelm, they were all cousins. They were all relatives. They all look alike also. That's interesting. Prince Harry looks, by the way, like them. He's undeniable royal. But they were not very smart, and they went to war against each other for actually no reason. There's no reason why they went to war. So, you know, society changes a lot. I was just talking to someone an hour ago. I said to him, you know, there's 2 things that I never thought were possible in my life. One of them was that we would have negative interest rates, that central banks would be so dumb and push down interest rates to negative territory in nominal terms, like we had in Europe, we had in Switzerland. We had close to $10 trillion worth of bonds that were negative yielding in Europe until just recently. Now they're all positive again. But this is an anomaly. When I started to work in 1970, and when I studied, interest rates were much higher when I started to work. The 10 years treasury was at 6%. Already in 73, it went to over 12%. The 10 years today is 2.6%. And the other thing that I never thought is possible is that society would change this much over such a brief period of time. You know, when my parents went to work, when I started to work, I never thought of the government helping me. I thought, well, I finished my studies. My parents paid for my studies. Now it's my turn to go and earn some money. As simple as that. I never asked for any safe space or anything of that sort. I mean, you just went, and you went to work when the company told you to work, and you went home when the company told you to go home. In between, you were free. You could do whatever you wanted. But when you work, that it was also the education I got at the Boy Scouts and also the education I got in the military. I wasn't a great soldier, but I mean, I went to the army, and to some extent, it was a good lesson for life because you are with all kinds of people. They come from different backgrounds, and so on, and you have to live with them, and you sleep in a dormitory with like 30 different people. You somehow, somewhere have to get along with them.
Very interesting points. So much to dive into. I wrote down some questions while you were speaking, and I wanted to speak about what's been dubbed the biggest bull market in history. And I know throughout the 2010s, you predicted, and many people predicted that things would turn around. But I think the monetary policies of the Federal Reserve did work to drive certain asset prices higher during that period. Although I do think we've seen diminishing returns in terms of quantitative easing type policies. $1 trillion bailout in 2008, 2009 was like, wow, mind blowing. And now we're looking at like $6 trillion bailouts as well, which have led to what I would call a little bit of inflation. I know a lot of people are saying it's a lot, but I would say a little bit of inflation in the West, in the US, which is hurting first and foremost the poor, not so much the wealthy. The wealthy are buying luxury products just like they always were. Now, Epic Times. So they write that the history's biggest bull market leaves 80% of Americans behind, written by Lance Robert, published March 30th. Despite the largest bull market in history, 80% of Americans struggle with their finances and are unprepared for retirement. Such a reality is a stark difference from the belief that rising asset prices benefit the masses. What are your thoughts on this so-called biggest bull market in history? And I guess also, perhaps more generally, Dr. Faber, are we in the gloom part of the cycle, the boom part of the cycle, or are we already in the doom part?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say we need to be very careful when we talk about the biggest bull market in history, because are we looking at just the US or at international markets? I mean, I remember in 1973, 74, the Hang Seng Index fell from 1,700 to 150, okay? Down more than 90%. And recently it hit the high in 2015 of something like 37,000. And Hong Kong shares have high dividends. So the total return, say 1973 to the peak in 2015 or so, was a huge bull market. You take Japan, 1950, and the peak in 1989. In 1970, the Japanese market had already gone up a lot, but IBM alone had a larger market capitalization than the entire Japanese stock market. By 1989, the Japanese market, as I told you, was 50% of the world. So the US stock market rally that we had 2009 to today is not the biggest in history. If you tell me 1982 to today, yes, it's been a huge bull market. It was interrupted by a 41% decline in 1987. In one day, it dropped 21%, the Dow. 21% in one day. 21% in one day today would be a lot of decline, I can tell you. A lot of margin calls would go out. But what is unique in the current bull market is that it's not just a bull market in stocks, it's also in real estate. It's also in bond prices, more so in bond prices actually than people realize. We were the high in 1981 for the 10 years Treasury note was 15.84%. We went down to less than 1%. We're now at 2.6%. So we had a huge bull market. We also had a huge bull market in art. Any kind of art you bought, the modern artists 30, 40 years ago, you just spread into 20 different ones. For sure, one did very well. And so forth. So stamps and any kind of collectible did well. And this is the problem with the Fed. For the Federal Reserve, they define inflation by the consumer price index or personal consumption expenditure index, which is very questionable, because if stock prices go up, I can say, or you may say it's a bull market, and I say, no, it's inflation in financial assets. It comes about partly because of improving economic conditions, but mostly because of improving liquidity conditions, which are created by the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world, and so forth. So I think, yes, we had a big bull market, but as you know, in the last few years, the bull market has been very selective. In other words, until last year, for the, say, 5 previous years, the bull market was mainly driven by the FANG-related stocks: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, and related semiconductor stocks and, cloud computing and so forth and so on. And in the last 2 years, meme stocks, any garbage that didn't have any earnings and no prospects of earnings, were driven by fantasy. I call them the Robin Hood crowd and the Reddit crowd investors that have dreams, visions, and no earnings. And so these stocks went ballistic. And it's interesting, last year, the meme stocks peaked out in January, February 2021. And the last ones to peak out, the NASDAQ 100 and so forth, the big stocks, were between November 2021 and January 2022. The meme stocks, say, represented to some extent by ARK Innovation ETF, okay? ARK Innovation ETF peaked out at over $157 in January 2021. It's now at 61, down big time. So that gives you an impression of what has happened to this great bull market. A lot of stocks are down. You can open any tech stock. Most of them, with the few exceptions, the FANGs are not down 50%, but a lot of other stocks are down 50% and more, some 80%. I have a list of, say, 50 unicorns. These are all the stocks like Uber and Beyond Meat and so forth. They're all down 70, 80, 90%. So the carnage has been very significant. And my sense is that if I look at major lows are 1920, 21 after the First World War. Then we have a major peak in 29, then a major low in 32, and then again in 1941, and just after the war in 42, 47, 48, and then a major peak in 66 and 73. I'm mentioning these two because we have to measure inflation adjusted or not, or in nominal terms. And then there was another major high in 2007. And now we are, by valuation standards, at a very high level. And especially whereas in the 70s, the stock market capitalization as a percent of the economy was only 30% or 25%. Now it is 150%. And then you add the bond market capitalization that used to be small in the 70s. The debt level was very small in the 70s, debt, household debt and so forth. Now it's astronomical. I just looked today at student loans. The last time I looked at was like 5 years ago. 5 years ago was $1 trillion. Now it's $1.75 trillion. It's never going to be repaid. So these are things to consider. The value of money has lost a lot. Another feature when I was young, when growing up in the 50s, both my grandparents on my mother's side, they owned a hotel in the mountains, and my grandparents, they said, oh, when in your life, you always need to save some money, put some money aside because bad times are coming. And we in Europe, we went through the war. I can tell you it was a harsh time. Like in America, people went through the Depression, was a very tough time for all families because there was no social security. This is the first time in history, 5,000 years of documented human history, that we have social security. And I'm sure the social security system will all go bankrupt everywhere. All. They'll pay you, but they pay you in depreciated money. And some may not be able to pay because they won't have money. So anyway, this is what I wanted to say. Social history and economics and stock market cycle, they somewhere merge, and they bring either like the capitalistic system. In America, you ask young people, 60% will say, well, the government should do this and the government should do that. And there's this movement where the socialists, they may not say they're socialists, they can hide it and say, oh, we are in favor of vaccines, or we are in favor of clean energy, the green crowd that gathers in places like Glasgow, and they all fly in private planes there. What they say and what they do are two different things. But all these people, they want essentially more government interventions when it is documented that countries like India, China, the former Soviet Union, when these communist regimes collapsed, and when market-friendly economics were introduced through a reform process, their economies took off. Never before in history has the world overall been this rich and well-to-do as now. But all the communists that come from the regimes they are fleeing, namely Latin America, Eastern Europe, and so forth, they arrive in our capitalistic systems and they want to introduce socialist policies. They're brain damaged. They're going to get socialism, yes, lower standards of living.
Lower standards of living right now are being blamed on, despite many experts predicting that this would be the trajectory of the American economy for far more than 10 to 12 years, decades, on Russia. It's the Ukraine war, the Russian incursion into Ukraine territory is the reason why the proverbial wheels are coming off the bus in the West. Yet it seems that there are so many policies which inhibit, primarily in the US, the growth of, I think, small businesses. Largely lockdowns come to mind, welfare programs come to mind. That could it be, what do you say to people who say that the reason why gas prices are going high, food prices are going higher, the currencies are being devalued is because of the Ukraine war and Russia's incursion?
Well, I tell them, first of all, you need to be very careful in analyzing why the war occurred. Maybe you should look at whether Putin was put in a position where he almost was forced to do something. Certainly not in the whole of Ukraine, but certainly in eastern Ukraine, where you have a majority of the Russian population. And in 2014, he took the Crimea, but Crimea is 98% inhabited by ethnic Russians, not Ukrainians. And Ukrainians, who are they? Part of Ukraine belong to the Austrian Hungarian Empire, so they're partly Austrians and they're partly Polish and so forth. Of course, during World War II, the Ukrainians already cleaned out the Polish. They killed them off in one of the great, it wasn't the Holocaust, but it was a genocide. In any event, one has to analyze very carefully. It's also, if people say, oh, the Second World War is due to the Germans, we need to be very careful with that statement, because there were other participants similar to, oh, the Russian Revolution was because the Tsar was a dumb idiot. Yeah, he wasn't particularly smart. The whole family, these royals, whether they are in Britain or in Belgium or Holland or Denmark or Germany or the Tsar, they were never very smart. But equally, we have to see who wanted the revolution. As you know, a man called Trotsky went to America to raise money for the revolution, and he got a lot of money. I can tell you. I can also tell you from whom he got the money. Anyway.
Tell us whom. Wall Street? Any specific
Wall
names?
Street, yes. Hitler also got money from Wall Street. A lot. A lot. And not just from white supremacists. I'd like to point this out. Anyway, this is now besides the point. But the price level in America and worldwide began to increase long before the Ukraine invasion on January 24, 2022. The Federal Reserve and the ECB and the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan, they were fast asleep at the wheel. They knew prices were going up because they kept on saying it's transitory, okay? If you register the price increase and you say it's transitory, you know that prices are going up. But I have to say one thing, that, you know, is a disconnect. There exists a disconnect between these incompetent bureaucrats that sit in governments in Western democracies and ordinary people, because these incompetent bureaucrats, these academic morons, they don't go shopping. For them, whether food prices go up a bit or not is of no relevance, because it's all paid by the government and they have large salaries. And then, like for me, if the price of food goes up, what do I care? It's not an expenditure. What for me is an expenditure is the price of cognac and whiskey goes up, but not the food. And it's a small percentage of my income. But for 90% of the people, the ordinary people in this world, I just looked at statistics, you know, there's only 8% of the people in this world that are 65 years and older. The majority lives a different lifestyle than you and me. You sit on somewhere on a river or a lake with a beautiful, in a beautiful property. I sit in a large office. This is a unique lifestyle. Typical people, they suffer from rising food prices. But the Fed was never created to help ordinary people. It was created to help rich people. It's like the Consumer Council. It's not created to protect the consumer. It's created to protect large companies. The SEC, do you think the SEC cares about the small investor? That's what they say. They care about big investors, hedge funds, and let them front run the retail investor. They let companies like Schwab and Robinhood and so forth sell the data, the trading pattern to hedge funds. Why do they let them do that? This is to front run the order flow. You think the FDA protects the consumer? The FDA protects big pharma. All these agencies, democracy says, oh, we are here to give the ordinary people the voting right. No, it creates a bureaucracy, an elite, and gives the impression of the people that they have something to say. It's a facade. The stock market, believe me, was not created to enrich poor people. It was created to enrich the rich even more than they already are.
Any thoughts on, I want to dive into the Fed, but before I get there, I want to ask again on the Russia-Ukraine situation, the effects you see the sanctions having on the global economy.
Well, first of all, you know, when the war broke out, the ruble collapsed. And since then, it's rallied significantly. It's now down 6% year to date. So it's down actually less than the Japanese yen. And because prices were going up before the crisis, before the conflict, but they kept on going up. So at the present time, Russia has a huge current account surplus. And when the Western media tells you, oh, the whole world has sanctioned Russia, what they mean is America, its vassal, the European Union, and its collaborators, the UK, Canada, and Australia. The rest of the world hasn't sanctioned Russia. 88% of the world's population has not sanctioned Russia. Because if they sanction Russia, they have to go back and say, well, how many people did the US kill in Iraq? How many people died of hunger because of the embargo of Iraq when they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction? I just watched a video yesterday. Colin Powell, the great American, of course, a hero of the Black community. Well, he went to the UN and said, I have proved they have weapons of mass destruction. The UN weapons inspector, BRICS, he always said, no, they don't have that. So anyway, I tell you, you know, you want to start with war crimes, I can give you some countries that have carpet bombed. 3 countries here in Southeast Asia, 3, not 1, 3. And the consequences are visible even today at the deformation at birth of people.
Now, I think it's arguable we could even cite what I would argue were economic embargoes on non-big box stores in the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak and the effect that it reportedly has had on poor people, especially in undeveloped countries and what's commonly referred to as the third world.
Yes, it's horrible.
Yes. And so now so you mentioned the Fed several times, so I do want to read excerpts from Senator, I believe, Cynthia Loomis, might be Lummis, an American banker. She wrote "What I Expect from President Biden's Fed Nominees," and she essentially goes into the effects that Fed policy has had on Wyoming specifically. Unfortunately, recent Fed actions and nominations that have occurred under President Biden's watch caused me to question whether the Fed is losing sight of its core mission in our system of government. I would interject here and say that it is an academia referred to as a public-private institution, for what that's worth. They do have .government email addresses, those who work at the Fed, as Danielle DiMartino Booth notes. She worked at the Fed. She was an Austrian at the Fed. She said there might have been some other Austrian economists at the Fed, but they would have kept them in the basement most likely. Anyway, continuing what Lummis had to say, in particular, personal financial gain and political causes have crept into the Fed in the eyes of some, which reflects poorly on the institution as a whole, especially given its enormous independence and power over our daily lives. My home state of Wyoming has also suffered from a Federal Reserve that has consistently failed to follow the law and has frustrated responsible innovation. Wyoming special purpose depository institutions are the first attempt to responsibly integrate digital assets in the U.S. banking system and are entitled to access to the Federal Reserve's payment system as a matter of law. So here they're creating blockchain-friendly legislation in Wyoming. There's so-called Bitcoin banks, and these banks, in many cases, they're cryptocurrency exchanges, want access to the Fed payment system. They have yet to receive it. So Lummis continues, quote, even though Congress has imposed a one-year deadline on all Fed applications, nearly 2 years later, Wyoming institutions are still awaiting approval to access the payment system. So here we have a senator in a very professional and conservative tone criticizing and critiquing the Federal Reserve. Can you dive a little bit deeper into your critiques of the Federal Reserve?
Well, it's very simple. And Milton Friedman has expressed this view. You don't need a group of people. You could let the computer do the work. And as you know, your Senator Loomis says that the Biden administration, I just like to point out, Jerome Powell was appointed by Trump, okay? Now, he may not have appointed him, but the people who were behind Trump, they appointed him. Let's put it this way, because you and I, and nobody knows for sure who actually rules America. We know one thing for sure, it's not Joe Biden. It's someone behind him. Most likely, this is the third administration of Mr. Obama. Sadly, because Mr. Obama has already destroyed an enormous amount of the US economy. And is he an American really in spirit? Or is he a destroyer of America? Is a different story. But let's not get into this political discussion. What I want to say is that the Federal Reserve, when it was created, a lot of people, including it was created under Woodrow Wilson. He said, this is the saddest day in my life to have created institutions like that. And since then, the US economy has actually grown in real terms, inflation adjusted, less than in the 19th century when there was no Federal Reserve. In the 19th century, 1800 to 1900, we had economic growth and no inflation. You get that? No inflation. The price level in 1900 was like in 1800. But with the Federal Reserve, inflation has picked up. And, you know, people, Steve Roach, he recently wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and he laughed kind of about Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns was the Fed chairman between, I don't know, 71 and 78 before Paul Volcker. But as I said, Burns already in 73, he had the prime rate at 12%. They pushed it up in 78 to something like 15%. So it's not that he completely denied that there were price increases. The current Fed has completely overlooked the fact that prices were going up for most people, through rising healthcare costs. Obamacare is a complete failure. It has enriched some people and impoverished the majority of people that pay high premiums for low services. And a lot of services are excluded, and the choice is excluded. And then we have high housing costs. I mean, nobody can tell me that the Fed didn't see that the rentals were going up after 2009, after the slump that was maybe manufactured by purpose. So poor people were kicked out of their homes, and rich hedge funds guys could come in, private equity, to buy all the developments. I don't know. I don't want to criticize the rich people too much, because I'm in favor of the capitalistic system. And I have a great sympathy if someone like Bezos or Musk and so forth, they have a lot of money. Better they have the money than the Clintons and Obama and Trump and all these political nuisance creating people that never did anything in their life except create trouble. So the capitalistic system creates inequalities, that is for sure. But the government creates only lower productivity growth, because you have to see also one thing with this zero interest rate. At zero interest rates, what grows the fastest? The government. Government is like a cancer. It starts in a society at this size, and it comes like this. We are in Europe, all the countries, they were at, say, around 10% of GDP was government spending 100 years ago. Now it's more than 50%. In America, if you add everything together, it's between 45 and 50%. The economists who are bullish on everything, they will tell you is only 41%. But actually, when you add everything up, it's close to 50%. And when interest rates will go up, you understand, then the Fed also promote these economies, the modern monetary theory economies. That said, the household, your private household, is limited in terms of borrowing, because you can go bankrupt, but the government can just print more money. Where are all these people now? They can just print more money. But now the Fed governor, suddenly, even the doviest one, this Blainard or whatever, she was also candidate for the Fed chairmanships. She now realizes that the inflation hurts the poor people the most. But it has already happened, you understand? I have statistics from the Fed. It shows very clearly. A guy 35 years of age has less money than his parents had when they were 35 years old, and he earns less than the parents earned when they were 35 years old. It's as simple as that. But it's logical, because look at the Biden and Harris administration. Once you have these incompetent people in government, they're at the top, they should be the smartest ones, but actually the dumbest ones. They make the policies. Do you think they make policies to enhance growth? They destroy growth. And I'm glad in America there's some states that rebel and say we have our own laws and we do this our way and so forth. And so I applaud Wyoming if they try an effort to have cryptocurrencies. It's not that I believe that cryptos are all going to be good. I think 90% of them will be worthless, but some maybe will survive.
I do want to get your thoughts on Bitcoin first and foremost, because I do think Bitcoin and cryptocurrency have evolved to become two different industries entirely. But first, I wanted to touch on, for instance, Obama and Biden as Obama's third term. Webster G. Tarpley wrote a book called Obama, the Postmodern Modern Coup, in which he noted that Zbigniew Brzezinski, the notorious Dr. Strangelove hawk and warmonger of the Cold War and inveterate Russia hater, had a few months before openly assumed a position of dominance inside the Obama campaign. He notes that with a little quick check, it was revealed to the author, Dr. Tarpley, that Zbigniew Brzezinski and his son Mark were shaping Obama's entire public profile along the lines suggested by Zbignew's most recent book. He also discusses how Zbig worked behind Carter and may or may not have been responsible, for instance, the adoption of the sweaters by Carter in order to give off a soft appearance to the public. And the idea with Obama was that the U.S. was ready and primed for an African-American Black president. And he notes that as he watched the media swoon over President Obama, that it became increasingly clear to him that he was watching a great intelligence community mobilization, one of the great ones of the decade. It was being shown on TV was no longer the standard coverage of a normal political campaign, but rather a propaganda exercise within the framework of a CIA covert operation. So if this is true, and Obama was a postmodern coup of, as Tarpley notes, the CIA and Wall Street, then what we're seeing today, if it is, you could argue the Biden administration this is Obama's third term, is really, I suppose, a intelligence agency presidency.
Please put intelligence in quotation marks, because I wouldn't call the people that are in Washington intelligent. I call them devious, liars, and unethical behavior that is unworthy of being in a public office. A public servant should work for the people and not against the people, and not favoring some groups over others. I think this is a big difference. If you accept to be the king of the feudal of a region, of a country, and you are a good king, you will say, okay, I will devote my life to do something as good as I can for my country. Unfortunately, throughout history, the elite has never done anything that is good for the people. They've done something good for themselves throughout history, irrespective of the government, whether it was a republic or a kingdom or how do you say, theocracy like they had in Egypt and so forth. At the end, the initial rulers usually have good intentions. I think that the founding fathers of America probably had good intentions, or they were very smart and devious, and they knew that it's gonna go down the drain after 100 years or so.
It's tough. It's tough to know, as you mentioned earlier.
It's tough to know. But one thing I can say for sure, none of the post-war presidents, with the exception probably of Eisenhower, I truly believe that Eisenhower was a man of some integrity. He wasn't the smartest bloke on the block, but he was kind of a decent man. That I believe. And probably the nicest and best president the US had was Coolidge. You know, the modest guys who said, I do this, I'm a public servant. But nowadays it's about egos and about, you know, power and the abuse of power.
Now,
and
with
money, there's big money in Washington.
we mentioned that you don't want to speak too tough against the rich. And really, I think that it's clear it's not so much that there are wealthy people or not that is so much a problem, but it seems that certain cliques have captured government agencies in which are supposed to be managed by an elaborate system of checks and balances theoretically, and then also by this notion of states' rights, 50 different states. Now, I will have two more questions left, and we only have about 5 minutes. And I do want to, so I wanted to dive into, you mentioned earlier how quickly the world changed and you didn't see it coming. This dependence on government, for instance, is one symptom. And I don't think it takes too much observation to look at bureaucrats today and realize that in so many ways, they are not the solution to problems more times than not, if ever. So with the world changing so quickly, we have organizations such as the World Economic Forum and its Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, pointing towards new industries that compose the fourth industrial revolution. So for instance, they are artificial intelligence, blockchain, digital assets, the Internet of Things, or autonomous vehicles. What are your thoughts on the World Economic Forum vision of the fourth industrial revolution, especially from the perspective of an investor?
Well, I would say I have a very negative impression of the World Economic Forum's agenda. It cultivates and is like a business school for a narrow elite of mostly Western leaders. You understand? If you belong to that elite and you do what their agenda is, like Trudeau is a typical product of that WEF agenda. He goes and says, oh, I'm in favor of democracies and so forth. As soon as there is a strike by the truckers, which I think was a legitimate strike, and someone donates to the truckers, he seizes their accounts. Yeah, I mean, you have to see this. The world is going to split apart between ordinary people and the government elite. There's a big split nowadays. Everybody knows the government isn't interested in us ordinary people. I don't consider myself ordinary because I benefited from the asset bubbles and so forth. So I'm not complaining about that. But as a social observer and an economist, it is my duty to remind the world that being in the financial sector was highly rewarding for people that haven't invented and haven't done anything in their lives when you really think of it. Number two, I'd like to say the WEF represents some educated morons like this Trudeau, as an example, and many people under him in Canada. Klaus Schwab, who, by the way, looks like the perfect Nazi in a movie. You know, he would fit into these old Nazi movies where there was a prison camp run by this Nazi fat guy and so on. He would fit in there wonderfully. But anyway, the rest of the world, they may go to Davos because of the connections and this and that, but the rest of the world doesn't trust these WEF people. And the rest of the world, you say Europe, they are in the wake of being a socialist, they accept the American being the paymaster, and essentially the Americans, they can bribe all kinds of organizations and so on. But the rest of the world doesn't accept that. Do you think the Chinese and Indians will be the vassal of the US? No way. No way. They have their independent policies. They have their own national pride.
In 2 minutes, let's say I was able to get you a birth certificate, a forged birth certificate. And I know a guy in Tijuana, and we got you the first certificate, and then you became president of the United States of America, leader of the free world, Dr. Faber, what solutions to the monetary crisis would there be to the US dollar crisis that you could implement, and would metals and or Bitcoin play a role?
Well, I mean, I would need to hire some advice on the cryptocurrencies, how to implement it in a way that you can't abuse it. Because as you know, with Bitcoins, if you really start mining with quantum computers, maybe you can increase the quantity. But I'm not concerned about Bitcoins per se. I'm more concerned that everyone will create a cryptocurrency, and there'll be so many around that only very few will survive. I happen to think that Bitcoin will survive, but I think a lot of others will not. This is one point I'd like to make. Number two, I think it depends on a lot of factors. As I said, we have this world, the Western world, with the vassals, Australia, Canada, Europe, and Britain, and we have the rest of the world. I'd say one question the investor has to ask himself is, where do I want to park my assets? Just to diversify and keep all the money at Citigroup in New York or in Canada may not be a very good idea. Maybe you should keep some money in Dubai and in Hong Kong and in, I don't know, Mumbai or so. I mean, this is something someone has to think about. I would be very uncomfortable, say, when I see that they kind of expropriate and seize the assets of the oligarchs, I have no sympathy for the oligarchs, you understand? For me, they're just a billionaire like another billionaire. They took advantage of an interesting situation in 1990 during the privatization. They didn't steal the assets, as some commentators say. They bought the vouchers for nothing. We had the first Russia fund, the Firebird fund. We also bought vouchers at next to nothing. I also did buy, for me personally, vouchers. But I wasn't in Russia. I couldn't accumulate as many as the oligarchs. But anyway, this is a long story. I think that first of all, there's no chance that anyone would vote for me to become president of the US. So if you give me the title, I would cut the bureaucracy by 50%. If I had the power, son, maybe you don't have the power. But it seems to me that some people get, that worked in government, they retire 55. They never did anything in terms of responsible job. They get pensions of more than $100,000 a year. And the taxpayers, they're sucked to death. Taxes are high in the world. That I can tell you, in the Western world. It's difficult to become rich because of the high taxation, including Canada, to finance the welfare system of Mr. Trudeau and to finance his corruption and the government officials' corruption.
We're all out of time. I want to thank Dr. Marc Faber, the publisher and editor of the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Faber.
Well, it's a pleasure for me. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to express my views. I hope we can do it again in future. I hope the video won't be censored.
We will see. Stay tuned. Either way, I'll be back. We'll be back. I'd love to do it again sometime. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye, you too. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.